What's up, YouTube? Today I want to talk about the history of Jerusalem and how it applies to different religions and what exactly makes Jerusalem holy, specifically what's referred to as the Temple Mount, which is really disputed. We're going to figure out why it's holy to all three religions. So we're going to look at the history of Jerusalem. When you go to 3500 all the way to 2000 BCE, Jerusalem was primarily inhabited because, by the ancient Canaans, because it was pretty much just a hilltop area. It was easy to defend when you're talking about warring tribes. It also had something called Jihan Spring, and this is sort of located where the Temple Mount is. It's not too far from it. And one thing about this spring was it seemed to be holy because it just seemed to, at certain times, literally gush water out. And so the people living at the time associated it with many pagan gods and such. And in 1900 to 1000 BCE, Egyptian records actually, the name was all the way back then in 1900 BCE, the name Jerusalem. Um, it was actually named after a god known as Shelem. And so a lot of things with language now is that, it sounds like the word salam or shalom, which means peace. So, certain words, it initially was named after a god, but certain words, tend to transition over time. Shalem, the god, was the god of dusk and completion. And, just like there's the Greek gods, these ancient Canaans, they believed in, the same concept that there was many different gods, and at the top was El Elyon. So it kind of sounds like Elohim, but obviously, words get replaced. So, it's sort of, meant to say that, hey, we got monotheism now, so we're going to replace Elyon with just meaning, the all high God. There's only one God. There's no, pantheon or multiple gods or whatever. So now we're going to kind of get into the monotheistic stages. So in 1000 through 622 BCE, King David captures the city. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there. The Ark of the Covenant is sort of like a treasure chest that contains the Ten Commandments. It contains holy food that God provided to the Jews. It also contains Aaron's staff. And, David's son, Solomon, he built the first temple. Now, this is where essentially, specifically to Jews and Muslims, this is the reason the Temple Mount as we know today, right where Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. This is why it became holy, because Solomon's a prophet in all three religions. And so he was the first to build that temple in 950 BCE. Following a long time afterwards, there was sort of a sage, or, you could say like a leader of the Jews. His name was Josiah. He made the claim that only God could be worshipped in Jerusalem, so you couldn't really worship him to his fullest in other parts of the world. So this temple ends up getting destroyed. So we're going to go to 586 through 538 BCE. There was a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. He destroyed the city and Solomon's temple. He also kicked out the Jews, and so the Jews had to flee to Babylon. At the time, the Jews also believed that this had happened because they were unfaithful. They weren't really following their religion to the fullest. And then so in 516 through 70 CE, the Jews were actually able to return to Jerusalem. This is because Cyrus the Great had, allowed them to return. He conquered, Babylon and sort of that region, and he allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. And during that time, the temple was rebuilt for the second time. However, it was built by an individual by the name of King Herod, and he wasn't viewed as a good man, right? He actually wasn't even viewed as someone who was monotheistic. He was just a Roman appointed king who was ruling over a Jewish population, and he wanted to appeal to the Jewish population. So he, builds this temple. It was more performative than anything else. And in 70 CE, there was a Roman Empire. Titus, at the time, he was a general, but he was an empire. Titus came and he destroyed the temple again. And he also banned Jews from Jerusalem. So now we're going to go to 325 through 691 CE. And this is in 325. The Roman Empress Helena, she comes to Jerusalem. And, obviously this is, she's Christian. At this time, the Roman Empire finally becomes Christian. They're no longer pagan. Jesus, this is his homeland. This is his, sacred area for Jesus. And so this is, near the Temple Mount area. This is when the Holy Church of Sepulchre is built. It's to represent where Jesus was crucified and where he was resurrected. That still stands there today. I've been to all these locations. And then at the time, so the Christians had left the Temple Mount area destroyed purposely. And they also left, they usually use it as a trash dump, to metaphorically represent that we are not Jews. This is not the correct religion. We follow Jesus, this and that. So there was a lot of, dispute, even though the Christians also view Solomon as a prophet. So, it's kind of weird to me to think that they would purposely just leave it as a dump. But then it goes to show that, the religions are a lot closer than most people want to believe. It's just the political things that separate it. So in 691, the Umayyad Caliphate came and built the Dome of the Rock. So now here's the thing with this. Omar built this because it was the site of Solomon's temple. Okay, so it wasn't disputed by the Muslims at the time that this is where Solomon's temple was. It was called Beit el-Maqdas, and in Hebrew, the Jews also referred to it as Beit ha-Maqdash, the holy house. So you could see that they're honoring actually a Jewish site. They're acknowledging that these were Jews, people of Hebrew. Although the terminology for religion is its own thing, right? But they're all essentially people following the one God. Into Muslims, it was to honor Prophet Abraham, David, Solomon, all the whole family tree of prophets who came from Jerusalem, came from the Hebrews. And so it also was sacred to Muslims because this is where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did what's called Isra and Miraj. And this is when he traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem on a winged horse, which you could almost associate with Pegasus. He went from Mecca to Jerusalem, and while he was there, he led all the prophets in prayers. He ascended the seven heavens. He actually was brought up from Jerusalem all the way up to heaven, and ascended the seven heavens. And so, Jerusalem, because this happened, it's always been viewed as almost like a portal. It's referred to as the Holy Land, and obviously every single, the Quran, the Bible. And, what exactly does that mean? It means that it's sort of the portal to the heavens. So it's sort of, Jerusalem is connecting the physical and the divine. And so, Umar personally, he was the Caliph Umar ibn Khatib. He personally rebuilt this mosque, obviously to honor Solomon, because this is where his temple was, to honor Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He cleaned the site. He was disgusted that it was used as a garbage, area. And so, that was his rationale. And in actuality, there's a lot of Jewish historical texts that praise Umar for restoring access to the Temple Mount after centuries of Christian destruction. So, the Jews were allowed back in Jerusalem. They were allowed back to the Temple Mount and to their area. And also they viewed that, hey, even this guy's Muslim, but he cleaned up the site. He's respecting Solomon. He's respecting the temple. This is the holiest of holiest for Jews. This is essentially the third holiest site for Muslims. Um, and they also, the Muslims also left the Holy Church of Sepulchre, so they never destroyed that, and that still stands today. Um, so also an interesting thing is inside Al-Aqsa Mosque there is a rock. There's sort of a cave, and then at the top of the cave there's this rock that looks like it's elevating. And interestingly, I never knew this, but recently figured this out, is that this is actually holy to Jews as well, and it's called the foundation stone, Even HaShati in Hebrew. And so what the Jews believe is that the rock is the point at which God started creating the earth. So this is literally the first physical creation of earth. They also believe it's where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and where the Ark of the Covenant was stored during the time the temple existed. Also, you ever see the Wailing Wall, where people see the Jews like kind of praying to that wall? That is, for Orthodox Jews, for most main Jews today, it's believed that you're not allowed to go onto the Temple Mount unless you've been purified, and that the Temple Mount is only supposed to be rebuilt by a Messiah, a prophetic figure. So it separates today from politics, is right. We all know what's going on. I'm Palestinian. We all know what's going on between Palestine and Israel. So there's a lot of politics that have injected into this, where there's a segment of the Jewish population who feels that they need to rebuild the temple, although when you go to the scripture and the Jewish belief, it has to be built by a messianic figure, a holy figure, and before someone could walk on the Temple Mount, they have to be properly cleansed, and there's a whole procedure for that to be cleansed. It even has to be with like a red cow, very specific things that have to be done before someone's allowed to step on there. So because of those things that exist, the wall is considered, really where Jews are supposed to pray, even though the Temple Mount is the most sacred spot to them. Interestingly, Muslims also view this wall as holy because when Muhammad was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem to finally to heaven, that horse that took him from Mecca to Jerusalem, Muslims believe he was tied on this wall. So yeah, there has to be, there's a lot of different factors that need to happen and things that need to happen before the messianic figure in Jewish belief can rebuild this temple. Jews have to follow the Sabbath, which Sabbath just means, Saturday. It's just like six, the sixth day, but excuse me, seventh. But that has to be followed. All Jews need to go back to the Holy Land. Just overall, more Jews need to be holy in order for the Messiah to come down. So it can't really be something that's forced politically, or someone just says, hey, let's build it. So Christians essentially, as I talked about, they view it because of Jesus was, obviously Jesus is the most holy figure to Christians. It's interestingly because this is where people believe Jesus was presented. Temple Mount was where Jesus was presented as a baby, where he was taught by a rabbi, and where he also taught as a rabbi. And there's an interesting case of where the Temple Mount, it used to be, a lot of people would sort of make pilgrimage here, and till this day, there's always people who exploit pilgrimages for money. I see that big with Saudi Arabia. When a lot of Muslims go to the Kaaba, they exploit it. So they charge absurd prices, because they know people have to do that. And so Jesus saw this even back then. People were doing it today. They're still doing it. So Jesus saw that there was a lot of people who were like overcharging for people making the pilgrimage to the Temple Mount. And so he flipped the table of the thieves, is what it's called. And the table was essentially where people were taking money, and it's a bunch of merchants. And obviously, the Holy Church of Sepulchre is near the Temple Mount, and this is a crucifixion resurrection spot. And so there's a sect of Christians called the Evangelicists, and they believe that a third Temple Mount must be rebuilt in order for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So you could see that there's a lot of political alignment because of that. To Muslims, this is a very holy site for the reasons I mentioned, because of Solomon, because Muhammad, peace be upon him, came to this location to do the Isra Miraj, or basically traveling to heaven. And even early Muslims used to face Jerusalem during their prayers. Um, and so what happened, today is a lot of political issues. And the thing is that politics and religion don't mix. They're on two different planes. They're on the whole opposite side of the spectrum. But the thing is that people tend to mix religion and mix politics together. And I've sort of touched base on that, but they do that because they want to promote politics over, over basically what the core of religion is saying. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when many Jews started immigrating to, modern day Israel and Jerusalem, um, a lot of, sheikhs and leaders had to sort of change their frame and say, hey, we don't know that Solomon's temple was here, right? There's no evidence that Solomon's temple was ever here. Um, that's not why Al Aqsa Mosque was built here. Al Aqsa Mosque was literally built to be Solomon's temple, to be the literally the third temple. And it essentially is, because a temple doesn't need to have specific things on it. A temple doesn't need to be a specific shape, right? A place of worship doesn't need to look a certain way. Okay, when you see what the way a mosque looks like, and you see a way, a Jewish structure looks like, and you see the way a church looks like, most of those things have nothing to do with the religion. They just have to do with the architect of the culture that built it. So you could say that most churches just have a Roman architect associated with it. Most mosques have like an Arabic, Umayyad Caliphate, type of design. Even the Kaaba, the fact that it's black and it has those gold stripes, that has nothing to do with Islam. It has to just do with, this was the caliphate that, took it over, and they decided to change the way it looked. And even there was other Muslims, who were sort of vying for power over how the Kaaba should look. It's sort of like they put their flag on the Kaaba, right? So we're saying that since the beginning of all monotheistic religions, the beginning of time, that politics and religion have been intersected together. And so, the point is that later on, when more Jews started coming in, a lot of Muslim scholars wanted to detract away from why Muslims built the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the first place. Um, there's probably so many Jews and Muslims who don't even know that, it's also called the Dome of the Rock. So it's literally a dome, but under it is the rock. They probably don't realize that they both view this rock as holy. Um, to many, Jews living in Israel today, um, it's because of the politics of the situation. They now want to build a temple there and walk on the Temple Mount, even though those things are it's supposed to be built by a messianic figure, not a political figure. And you're not supposed to walk on the Temple Mount unless someone's been ordained to do so. And it's not really something you can force politically. There's a political leader who appeals to a certain segment of the Israeli population, says we need to build this. At the same time, Muslims shouldn't hold only ownership over Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Temple Mount. Their fears are that, well, if people start praying here, eventually Muslims aren't going to be allowed there, and eventually the mosque is going to be destroyed. But the point is that if a site is holy, it's holy. And actually, when you go back to the history, right now Iran and Israel are fighting. It was actually the Persians, Cyrus the Great, that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and actually allowed the Herod, even though he might have not been the greatest person ever, to rebuild that Temple Mount. It was the Muslims who allowed the Jews to come back in, and who saw that the Christians were desecrating the site, used it as a garbage disposal, and got so distraught and sad that he cleaned it up himself personally, and later built this mosque to honor Solomon. The Jews at the time really respected Umar, the caliphate, and they really respected the Muslims for making the Temple Mount holy again. and for allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem. It's only in recent times that so many of these religions started to detract from each other, that the Muslims and the Jews, now are fighting over essentially the same compound. And whether the Temple Mount today looks like a rectangle, or whether it looks like a mosque, it doesn't matter. It's still a holy site. And I'll give an example for that. In my local area, there was a church that went out of business. Nobody was showing up. I guess they couldn't pay it, whatever, so they sold it. Muslims purchased it and made it a mosque. But here's the thing, they left the structure exactly the same, which is fine. Nobody cares if it looks like a church, right? Or if it has Roman architect inspired, design. Nobody cares about those things. It's just a place that people can worship. So, I think the main point is that whether it's a mosque or whether it's a temple or whether it's this, it's it's the fact that this area is a portal between the physical and the spiritual. And it doesn't matter if there's almost nothing there, it's just open air, it's just the concrete and the stones that's there, and people want to pray there. It doesn't matter if there's a dome, it doesn't matter if there's a church, it doesn't matter if there's a temple, a square temple. Those are all human inspired architecture, and they have nothing to do with anything, as long as it's clean. And the people going in there are clean and purified in the same way that Muslims do wudu and they clean themselves. In its respected area, it's going to be holy. So that's my main point, is that it's interesting that really Jerusalem has been holy for a very long time, and that primarily all three religions view it as holy because it's the birthplace of monotheism. And so today we have politics and nationality that sort of try to detract from those concepts. But when you actually look at most of history, it was actually the Muslims, viewing it as holy because of the Jews, because of Solomon, because of Abraham, because of David. It was even Persians who were allowing the Jews to come back to their rightful place. It was Jews who were praising Muslims for cleansing this area and in rebuilding the temple and in putting a holy structure there, when the Christians had used it as a dump. So saying these things today, it seems so backwards, but ultimately, history is just a small bubble, and you might be living in the small bubble, and it changes people's perspective. But when you look at the large, historic, time frame, it sort of allows people's brains to expand and them not to be so influenced by current political situations. So thank you very much.